Hi all, and thank you so much for joining us. We're here together to discuss this year's census. We're going to be talking about it from an angle of disability justice and inclusion, what the way that disability is approached on the census means in terms of the national and global landscape for disability, what we'd like to see maybe done differently in the future. So I'm joined by Atif, Piers and Adam, who have each got their unique perspectives and some really important things that we need to discuss as part of this conversation on the census. So I'm Ellie, and I'm the Communications Officer at Diversity and Ability. My pronouns are she, her, and I am a neurodiverse and disabled person. So I have a lot of personal interest in what we'll be discussing today. Atif, if you'd like to introduce yourself first.
Hello, everybody. I'm Atif Choudhury. I'm one of the co-founders of DNA, and I'm its chief executive. And most importantly, really, I'm just here to enjoy this conversation and hope that you will get to participate in it in the various different forms that work for you.
Amazing. Thanks, Atif. And Piers, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, I'm Piers. I use they, them pronouns. I'm the Higher Education Policy and Partnerships Lead at Diversity and Ability. I'm not a co-founder comparative to my other wonderful, esteemed individuals. And I'm looking forward to this conversation as policy and census go hand in hand.
That's great, definitely true. And Adam, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Thank you, Ellie. I'm Adam Hyland. I'm one of the designing directors of DNA, and I'm the director of accessibility and inclusion, and I use the pronouns him, he, and I'm excited to be involved in this conversation today.
That's great, thanks Adam. So the census is due in this Sunday, the 21st. And in terms of how disability is approached in the census, there are 3 or 4 questions which touch on disability or touch on the lived experiences that definitely apply to all of us at least. So in terms of how those questions are worded, the census asks, how is your general health? Do you have any long-term physical or mental health conditions or illnesses lasting or expected to last 12 months or more? And do any of your health conditions or illnesses reduce your ability to carry out day-to-day activities? And so firstly, I'd love your initial thoughts, maybe when you did the census yourself, if you've already filled it out, when you saw those questions, what kind of came to mind thinking about the perspective that we all have on broader kind of disability, inclusion and justice? I'm going to go to Piers first for this one, if that's okay, Piers. So just kind of your initial thoughts about that question.
One of the questions in particular is pretty much worded the same almost as it was back in 2011. And it's important. Firstly, it reminded me, so the COVID stat data that the ONS delivered, the category of disability is based on the 2011 census. And so that was the first thing that came up, was just like, oh, they've used similar wording to the COVID data. It was very deficit model. It was also very much the Equality Act definition of disability, citing 12 months or more, which is interesting, particularly considering around about then was my 12-month anniversary, or when I was filling it in, was my 12-month anniversary of shielding. So I think that in the context of COVID and things, it was a very interesting way of describing disability in a negative way, but also in a way that I think many people who may have got long COVID or aspects of disabling factors because of COVID may not have been able to comfortably ask as well, to say, yes, I fall into this category. So for me, like the first couple of questions on sort of disability was sort of skirting around the issue and phrasing it in a very much a deficit way.
Atif, what do you think to that in terms of what Piers is saying about it being quite a deficit focused model with the language that's being used?
Yeah, a similar way, really. It's difficult to give justice to the narrative of so many of the complexities of human life, right? It really is. And the census is trying to build a narrative of what the country is and what the people are in it. It's a tough job, it really is. But a starting point is really looking at how this participation works, and is this data useful, and are people able to access being supported in it? So on one hand, and I'm conscious that tomorrow is the anniversary of the lockdown. Yeah, it will be that 12 months that Piers is essentially talking about, that for so many people has been so emotionally and mentally harrowing, as well as physically. So on one hand, I like that it has stayed away from labels, from what I can see, that it seems to be talking about how is your health in general. It's given space to talk about an impact, which I think is positive. But I'm challenged by the idea that, okay, you've got that space, but some of the most disabling impacts are going to be about whether you can find it easy to fill out these forms, to do the self-advocacy work that says, I am filling out this form and giving them the information they need to truly do a good job, to understand what it is that my human experience is. I'm also really conscious for a lot of people that in the UK, in fact, millions, in fact, the English will not be the first language. And those facing long-term marginalization from the workforce and access to education will struggle to do justice to what this experience is and how to fill it out on this form. As I said, I don't want to be negative to it for the sake of that. I think the census is always problematic. It has been historically problematic for disabled people since its inception. But I do think that there's something to be said for making sure that assistive technologies could have been invited in order to allow people to participate in the census, in a meaningful way.
Yeah, that's great, and definitely a really important way of looking at it and thinking about who we're excluding with the way that the census has been written and presented. Adam, I wonder if you could touch on that, if you could answer the question of who are we excluding with the way that the census has been written and presented to us as a general population.
I think that's a really poignant point, because we have to think about the wider narrative in the society that we live in regarding disability, and Piers touched upon a minute ago the question about the impact of day-to-day tasks over a 12-month period, which is very much aligned with the Equality Act, which is based on the social model of disability, where we're very much looking at the barriers in society. But I think we need to ask ourselves whether enough people have access to understanding the social model of disability, or whether there's still so much stigma and unknown around what that means in terms of disability rights perspective. But I think we need to look at the language of the questions, of course. I think there needs to be a wider conversation about the wider narrative around disablement and disability, what it means to individuals, but more importantly, do people identify with the concept that society puts barriers in their way. I think we are excluding people maybe who haven't got access and awareness of that social model in order to understand actually I am disabled by society. I think until we get that narrative right, until we get a safe space for people to share that data, then we're not going to get a true picture of how society is excluded on a wider level.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point about the social model of disability and whether that's accessible for society as a whole, and including disabled people in that, and whether we identify as disabled by society, or whether we still see ourselves as having a deficit, which is what's preventing us from accessing society. In terms of specific language that we use, we always talk about being disabled people, and there's so much of that is due to such a foundation of the social model that DNA is so central to everything we do. Do you think there would have been a benefit of including a word like disabled in the census and asking people how they identify? I'm going to start with Adam on this one because I think it follows on from what you were saying just then.
I think that's a very big question, and I think we need to acknowledge that people that don't want to connect with practicing a term that carries so much weight and stigma in society. And you're right, it's connected to the previous point, because I think more people would feel safe in sharing that if more people were aware of the social model. But I guess, I think using the word disabled person would still put people off sharing that impact. What we probably need to do is move one step further and talk about disablement as a social, environmental concept. The problem is that, if I'm being frank, is that I worry that if people don't know about the social model enough, is it time? Can we move to the next step yet? Which is talk about disablement instead of disabled people. I'm not sure we're quite at the tipping point yet, but I really want to be wrong on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really fair point, especially considering, as Atif was saying, the fact that the census is designed to be read and hopefully understood and accepted by such a diverse range of people who have English as an additional language, people who rely on assistive technology. There's a whole load of people who will be benefiting from the census and should be able to access it. So there is some really big questions about how much we can say without isolating and alienating a whole bunch of the people we're trying to include. Piers, what do you think about what's Adam saying and that kind of approach, aiming for disablement, but what we can maybe do in the meantime, well, before that's a well understood concept?
I very much agree with Adam that we, should be framing it as disablement, particularly given it does look at like the answers for how impacted are you. It's impacted a lot, impacted a little, not at all. Those are the three options, which are quite difficult to talk about your disability rather than disablement in that way. So I very much agree with Adam's point. Personally, I would have quite liked a split, one where it talks about the impact of impairment and the impact of disability in that, either medicalized or socialized model of disability, but also one which is about the identifying of yourself as disabled. So when I was filling out my census, I was able to put my ethnicity, I was able to put my religion, I was able to put my gender identity, my sex, and my sexual preference or orientation. But I wasn't able to put that I consider myself to be disabled with, either a capital D or a little d, because that's an identity. That's an identity that people have in society, and we work on that. Conversely, we also have people that don't identify as disabled, but do identify as having a disability. And I think that would have been a really great opportunity to have that catch-all where we can have the I identify as disabled, or I identify as having a disability, or have all language more involved. We don't have to have a one size fits all. So it could be, do you consider yourself to be a disabled person or a person with a disability? Use that multinational language that the UN use, that the US use, which they hop between the two, because even the disabled community don't agree with each other. And then finally, I think the biggest sort of area that the census missed is having a glossary, where those sorts of languages are defined that you can click through. They did have some guidance and links occasionally peppered throughout, but it's one of the most important accessible functions and features is that regardless of the language that's used, the language should have a glossary to enable people to understand, to enable people to know what people mean when they say certain phrases. And I think that is probably the biggest thing that was missed in the census, is that, click through glossary. Oh, there's a term there I don't understand. Click it, find out what the census understand that definition to be, so that I can decide whether I fall into that definition, that category.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, and really talks a lot about kind of who we're losing by not including those things. And I completely agree. I think that there is a wide number of us, it's a large number of us who have disability as part of our identity, who define as disabled people, or for other people may define as a person with a disability. Atif, I would love to know, it's a massive question, but Adam and Piers have done a good job of giving their opinions on it. What do you think should have been included in the census, or what can we hope for the next census to make it more accessible and more inclusive for everyone?
Thanks, Ellie. Yeah, I mean, I've touched on the idea that the language itself can be disabling. It's fundamental to participation that people are able to access the content, the value behind the words used, as well as what technologies may make that more meaningful and accessible. So it's a question on itself. I agree very much with Piers. It doesn't have, a glossary itself doesn't have to be static, but it just needs to say the census needs to say, when we say this, we are defining it in this way. Now they can back that up. We can debate whether they're right to do it, but at least they're saying, in the sake of this contract or this relationship or this document, this is what we mean. That's a real shame that didn't happen, and it was to be honest, quite a missed opportunity. I would also agree. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, that on one hand, I'm pleased that there's a space to talk about impact. I'm also pleased that there's space for carers and parents and people who have roles in care roles, which is a lived experience on its own, to have a role within the census and hopefully a voice in it. But I am also equally challenged. We should have had a campaign and plenty of time. Correctly, we've had 10 years. We have campaign space. In that 10 years, we've had the United Nations CRPD Accords, the Convention of Rights of People with Disabilities. In that space, we've had the Equalities Act. We've had an anticipatory support mechanism, hopefully being fulfilled. At times, yes, at times not, but it's there. So in that 10 years, we could also have an anticipatory support to say, many people will struggle with the census, and therefore we can talk about what we mean to define it and how we're defining it. And absolutely, I agree. Look, if I think about it, and I sort of wonder, look, I first got interested in census from a generation, I'm 47, and people watching this might sort of snigger at the point when we did censuses because it said Jedi, we got allowed to do Jedis. And we were a generation that for the first time, the hard to reach that wouldn't do census. And now we sort of did it. But I'm also conscious that, look, there are more millenniums after what happened in Cambridge Analytica and stuff like that, which really deeply distrust how digital data is abused and gathered and abused again. And our generation, we will say, yeah, this is too much admin. They haven't got time to mess with this. So we trusted it in a silly way or laughed at it. But actually, this data is meaningful because it, as I said, it carries the narrative of the country. One of the challenges we have is to say, look, the previous census, I wondered what it did in terms of sexual identity. It's quite binary from my recollection about being gay, straight. The idea of a generation seeing itself as fluid and not being out. How will the census adjust to that? How will the census really recognize that our country has a press, a media that seems to be obsessed with Islamophobia and making that an okay thing, and what that does for a culture of people and a religion of people who are afraid to put the word Islam on their forms, not because they're afraid or ashamed of their faith, but because just trusting what a government might do with that information is, these are questions and challenges that really the census has a lot of responsibility to put onto it. But likewise, I'll finish on this bit, mate, if I may, is I look at the UN SDG goals, for example. Of those 17 goals, a part of me says there needs to be more campaign to make them meaningful, and that's behind this. But I'm also really pleased that disability isn't there of the 17 goals. I know that sounds weird, but why? Why would you be pleased about that? Because it goes to the heart of disablement, that you cannot have a position on 17 goals of peace and justice, of partnerships, of eradicating poverty, about inclusion, healthy workplaces. You can't have that without the voice of marginalized people facing disablement. It's implicit throughout the entire 17 goals, but that needs to be super clear to every nation state signing up to it. And it's our job to do that. I apply the same thing to the census. If we're not going to be explicit about using the word disabilities or disablement, then make it super clear that you feel it's implicit to the culture and the narrative of what you're on the data you're collecting. And I think that's the point that's been missed here.
Yeah, absolutely. I think broadly, we're in agreement about what's been missed, what we'd like to see included. I mean, we have another 10 years before the next census. It will be interesting to see what we're able to say about it then, in terms of disablement, in terms of the language used, and in terms of how much people are working to make it an accessible process for everyone. So I'm looking forward to discussing that with you all then. Thank you so much.
Brilliant. Thank you, guys.